Hello everyone, my name is Oliver Crouch and I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Natural Capital Partners. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today, where we're going to be discussing how to get the best value from the money you're spending on renewable energy purchases. We've got 3 speakers lined up for you today, and I'm proud to say that they are all my colleagues here at Natural Capital Partners. I'll give you the briefest of introductions, but take comfort from the fact that they're all deeply experienced and networked through the various renewable energy working groups and sustainable business groups that are helping to advance our industry. First up, you're going to hear from Christiaan, who is a manager on the global markets team based here in our London office. Christiaan is the guy that interfaces with the renewable energy projects and will be providing you with a technical overview of the main EAC markets. Second in the running is Mark, who heads up our Americas team. Mark leads our client work, which involves working with the likes of Microsoft and H&M and BNY Mellon to help execute their renewable energy strategies. Mark is going to talk about the practical implications for businesses making renewable energy purchases. Then Saskia is going to wrap things up. Saskia is based in California and leads our client work across the Western region, helping companies like VMware and Intel to scale up their renewable energy purchases and deliver their renewable energy targets. Today, Saskia will talk about how companies can meet renewable energy goals and the important role they can play in kickstarting new markets for energy attribute certificates. Back to some logistics. I think we're scheduled for 45 minutes today and would like to leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions. You're all going to be in listen-only mode, so please use the panel on the right-hand side of the screen to submit any questions, and we will try and run through them in the time that we have at the end. Now, before we begin, we'd like to run a quick audience poll to find out your level of knowledge of energy attribute certificates and how they can drive value for business. You'll see that up on the screen now. Do you consider yourself to be expert, sort of medium, or are you just starting out on this journey? We'll give you a few seconds to respond before sharing the results. Okie dokie. And that should just be coming up on screen now. And we intend to run the same poll at the back end of the webinar as well to see if we've been able to progress any of you along this journey. Okay, so if you could move me on to the next slide. So before I hand over to my colleague Christiaan, I'd like to get you up to speed on some of the fundamentals of the energy attribute certificate market. An energy attribute certificate, or EAC, is a certificate which provides information about the environmental attributes of 1 megawatt hour of electricity. It could also be more broadly around energy. For example, there are green gas markets, but today we're going to be focused on electricity. And when it comes to corporate renewable energy claims, there are 3 main EAC markets: GOs in Europe, Recs in North America, and IRECs across the rest of the world. There are then a handful of markets like Australia, where we've labeled those as national systems on this chart, and these are often regulated markets that weren't explicitly designed with corporate renewable energy claims in mind, and as such, we're not going to be focusing on them as part of this session. But as you can see, there is now excellent geographic coverage, enabling companies to make renewable energy claims and achieve their goals, such as commitments to RE100. Our shading on this map extends to countries that are grid connected, to countries with EAC generation, where grid connectivity can be used as the basis for a credible renewable energy claim. For example, we have clients with consumption in Russia making a claim based on a Finnish guarantee of origin, or clients with consumption in Central America using an IREC from a neighboring country as the basis for a claim. The growth rates in these markets are particularly impressive, which are the color-coded charts you see on the screen now. These charts represent terawatt hours or million megawatt hours. And as I said, you can see some impressive growth. So if we look at the dark blue of the guarantee of origin market, I think the growth from 2017 over 2016 was in excess of 25%, and you can see similar growth rates, year on year for the Rect market in North America, which looks like it'll have broken through 100 terawatt hours. That's our estimate for 2017. The data for North America takes a little longer to come together. And then in light blue, IREC, you can see this is issuance data for IREC, stepping up above 4 terawatt hours, so breaking the 4 million megawatt hours in 2017, and we expect similar growth across all these markets for 2018. As I mentioned, the IREC market is the largest by far. With if you're the numbers on that chart just represent the geo market that's standardized by the European Energy Certificate System, but there are other markets like the UK that isn't part of that take European consumption well over 500 terawatt hours. If we look at IRECs, they're now issued in I think a little over 20 countries, and Natural Capital Partners has been working closely in probably about 16 of those markets to bring on new projects, most recently in Israel, and we're working on Mexico. And we expect to see kind of expansion with IREC across Africa and the Middle East in years to come. In terms of market trends, we're seeing more and more companies source renewable energy to demonstrate their commitment to climate action. As a result of that, we're seeing prices on a megawatt hour basis increasing, particularly in Europe and North America. So not only are the volumes in these markets increasing, but the values are stepping up significantly, more than doubling in both North America and Europe. And that's good because it's bringing more projects and more developers to the market. So after that little intro, I'm going to hand over to Christiaan, who's going to give you an overview on the optimal timing and customization of particular EAC purchases.
Thank you, Ollie, for that introduction. And of course, with two-thirds of the listeners already being expert anyway, I think that we can probably be fairly brief on the technical aspects. But to the first slide, when making a decision to purchase energy attribute certificates, there are of course many different aspects that will be of interest to the buyer. And while in many respects a megawatt hour is a megawatt hour, many buyers do want choice, preferring one technology over another or newer plant rather than old plant. Buyers may also want to support specific renewable energy that has been awarded a quality label, with the additional kudos that might bring. And of course, location is important. Under Scope 2 guidance, the source of the EAC doesn't have to be next door, but you do have to have a reasonable link, as Ollie already alluded to in his presentation. While not all the option combinations exist everywhere, fundamental to having any of these choices, of course, is availability, and that depends on the timing. For each of the main geographic locations mentioned, we will have a quick look at the implications of that. So first, North America. Recs underpin the renewable portfolio standards of a growing number of states across North America, and that includes the US and Canada. The earliest of those started in the 1990s, and now both the number of states, provinces in Canada of course, is growing, and the targets on each of those RPSs is increasing, and we are seeing some with very high prices indeed. The same recs are also used for our voluntary purposes. The compliance regimes and timelines, of course, are going to be restrictive for the availability for our voluntary purposes. The main standard used in voluntary markets in North America is Green E, but we are also seeing a growing interest for non-Green E technologies, particularly because of cost. Green E requires an audit to be completed for the whole supply chain of the REC. So that is from generator through to wholesaler, trader, all the way down to the user. And they do this in order to protect the claims that can actually be made under Green E. And of course also to make sure that all the requirements of the system are actually met. Green E needs the sale and the reporting year to match. And with the reporting year stretching a total of 21 months rather than a calendar year. Those 21 months for reporting year 17, for example, covered the period from Q3 2016 right up to Q1 2018. So 6 months prior to the start of the calendar year until 3 months after the end of that calendar year. And so then soon after Q1 2018, it is necessary to start that audit, that Greenie audit. And therefore the availability of any reporting year is greatly restricted after Q1 of the following year. To date, much of the Greenie volume has been based on attestations, whereas that will now switch to mandatory use of renewables. This may have an impact on the audit timelines, but at most that will be a handful or 2 months really. Fundamentally, of course, most flexibility and most choice would exist just earlier during the reporting year. So it's worth considering a purchase before the full consumption data is available for the year. Of course, any of the statewide compliance markets work to their own timelines and could further impact availability of RECs from those locations. Then, secondly, Europe, the biggest market for these certificates. You saw the numbers already in Ollie's presentation. It's about 5 times as big as the market in North America. Guarantees of origin are mandated by law in a European-wide renewables directive. So it is standardized across about 30 participating countries, and there are some differences, but it is fundamentally all standardized across them. A guarantee of origin is purely a factual statement of origin. So it really is exactly doing what it says on the tin. It guarantees the origin of that megawatt hour. So whether that's wind or hydro, or indeed it could be applying also to nuclear or combined heat and power, the guarantee of origin will simply say where it comes from. There is no judgment made on whether this is an acceptable technology or not. And whether it has any support through feed-in tariffs or anything like that. GOES are used primarily for fuel mix disclosure to end consumers in Europe. This, of course, is intended to give those consumers the information which they can make decisions about supply and whether to choose one company for their supply or another company. But also it helps, of course, to differentiate or to be the proof of a green tariff. Most countries in Europe are part of the European Energy Certificate System, EECS, which is the primary standard within Europe. EECS enables easy transactions cross-border with no risks of double counting, double claiming, or any like that. But there are also a couple of other systems, such as the UK's Renewable Energy Guarantees of Origin, REGOs. Because GOES are purely factual, there is a very strong presence of additional quality standards, which do make some judgment calls on, for example, on technologies or the age of installations. And they are proving quite popular in Europe, despite the additional costs. GOES are issued for the respective generation dates, primarily calendar years. And unless they are used, they automatically expire after 12 months. So 12 months after issuance, they just disappear from the registry. This means that the stock of 2017 guarantees of origin builds up through the year, but very rapidly declines once 2018 starts. So again, the availability is greatly affected from Q1 of the following year. And then finally, just looking at basically everywhere else. Of course, there are a variety of national schemes, including India, China, and Australia. But we are looking here at the markets that are outside the EU and North America in a more general sense. The biggest non-national global standard is IREC, but there are others as well, such as Tigers. IREC are still very small. You've seen the numbers on Ollie's presentation, but it is growing rapidly. Will it ever pick up with North America or Europe? Maybe not, but it is certainly growing very rapidly indeed. The international Rect standard was set up by a European organization that wanted to create a very similar to guarantees of origin, a very similar fact-based certificate that would be applicable everywhere else. Since its start, it has seen a very rapid growth as well in eligible countries. Most of these countries do not have national systems, but some do, and in those cases, of course, a very careful consideration is given on how to carve out that national system from IREX so that there can be no overlap and no double counting. IREX are issued for calendar years. They do not expire, and there is no audit either. However, IREC does apply a deadline for the issuance so that the residual mix can be calculated in a timely manner. That deadline is the 15th of May of the following year. So today, no more 2017 vintage IREC could be issued. While the issuance is fairly straightforward and very quick, this does of course mean that again, availability of any vintage is likely to decline very quickly after the end of Q1 of the year after. Then, if we're ignoring national schemes, the timelines for those various energy attribute certificates that we just discussed in those three regions is summarized in this slide. This is part of the paper that we are presenting here. You can see the 21-month of the Green E scheme, the 21-month generation cycle for the reporting year. You can also see the 1-year lifetime of the guarantees of origin and the calendar year for the IREX, although they do not expire, of course. And then I think under the Scope 2 guidance, it is recommended that the consumption and generation period be as close as possible. Each of these instruments, in principle, is okay, but you could still work towards that guidance in the best manner. Careful analysis, of course, of the various technicalities of these EAC standards shows that this will mean almost certainly that you should come to the market before your consumption data is confirmed if you want to have a wide choice of EACs. Of course, it does depend on your own company financial year. And I think that might be a good moment to go to our next speaker, Ollie.
Thank you very much, Christiaan, for that overview. I've seen that we've got some questions already in, which we'll go through at the end, but it's probably a good opportunity, as Christiaan mentioned, to plug that buyer's guide. So that timeline graphic that you saw comes from an EAC buyer's guide that we'll be publishing later this week, and we'll make sure that you guys receive a copy of it. But for now, I'd like to hand over to Mark, who's going to give you a bit of a deeper dive into what all this means for businesses that are committed to sourcing renewable energy.
Great, thanks, Ollie. Appreciate that. And next slide, please, in one click. There you go. Great, thanks. So, just want to look briefly at some of the challenge and practical implications for all of this, just based on some of our experience. And the first that you need to step back and look at is really what is the commitment that the company has made and/or the public claim. So, this sounds very basic and simple, but you need to really look at, make sure your procurement strategy is in alignment with the marketing and communications claims that you or information that you have out in the market. We've seen, on multiple occasions where, things have been lost in translation and, simple things like we're going to buy renewable energy wherever possible. Well, it's possible lots of places. It's also very expensive in certain markets. So, you really have to take a very pragmatic approach and make sure that you have really great alignment with your procurement strategy and how you're communicating the claims. There are stakeholders out there, particularly for larger companies. NGOs will pick up on those claims and call you on it if there's a disconnect. And And then, is your claim around renewable energy? Is it 100% renewable energy? By when? Do you have a roadmap? Something like Saskia, my colleague Saskia, is going to speak about here in a few minutes. If so, how much per year? What is the gradation of that claim? Is your goal carbon reduction? And companies can have multiple goals, but is it a specific tons or megawatt hours? Is it absolute or intensity based? Is it a goal for a specific site? We have many clients who have specific sites who are making claims for various certifications. And the carbon reduction question is important for both carbon reduction and carbon neutrality claims, because it opens up the door for using offsets, carbon offsets, to cover scope 2. We have many clients who still, some who even prefer using offsets for scope 2 because of the additionality that comes with carbon offsets. If your claim is carbon neutrality, is it carbon neutrality now? Is it in the future? And what scopes are you covering? Scope 1, 2. What are you covering from scope 3? Business travel, employee commuting, etc. So it's really important to have alignment with your procurement strategy and the claims that you are making, particularly those that you're making publicly. And then next, and then syncing budget cycles with EAC cycles. Chris has touched on this a bit, but this is a really important consideration. A lot of companies, if you're set up on calendar year, you may have a fresh new budget going into that year. But we all know, if many companies, certainly my experience is, just because it gets in the budget doesn't mean that you're authorized to spend. There may be rules about how actual expenditures are made. So is your budget available at the best time to procure EACs? And as Chris alluded, as you look at that chart, we generally believe coming out earlier in the calendar year is better than waiting until what always ends up to be sort of a big rush at the end of the year and going into the start of a new year. So is your budget available at the best time to buy EACs? And then if you're on a fiscal year, that presents additional challenges and opportunities. And without getting into a lot of the sausage making, there is an opportunity to, if you have demand, if you have adequate consumption, there is an opportunity to specify the production periods for your EACs so they could overlap. So you could use an EAC generated in a specific period for either fiscal or calendar year that you're reporting on. So lots to consider in the procurement practice. And then finally, moving to the reconciliation process, we find it often that the availability of final consumption numbers is often can be too late to purchase some EACs. As Chris explained, guarantees of origin. There's very tight requirements around matching consumption with production. U.S. Recs, there's a larger window. You've got that 21-month window. And then IREX, you have flexibility, but the challenge with some IREC markets, because they are emerging, is that there is limited supply. If you're you're coming to market late, you may not be able to get the EACs or the IRECs that you're looking for. So you know, it's really important. You know, we have some clients who, you know, have their reconciliation numbers. You know, the year closes January 31st, and you know, we're looking at final numbers by the middle of January. You know, and then at the other end of the spectrum, with some users, we're not seeing those numbers until, you know, March, April, even into May with some. So there's a real you know, question about you know, kind of alignment and availability for reconciliation. And then finally, you know, I think while the trend is toward, you know, reconciliation, you know, there are companies out there that have decided, you know, not to reconcile at all. We're going to purchase EACs based on, you know, our best estimate, primarily using previous year consumption. And if we roll that forward, you know, we're covering our claims, you know, within a 12-month window. So, you know, this is voluntary action. There are no, you know, Scope 2 guidance police out there, you know, so that, you know, there is an option to, you know, not reconcile, particularly, you know, for those of you that have gone through it, you know that, you know, just trying to balance a few hundred or a few thousand megawatt hours, you know, year over year can be quite labor intensive, time consuming. So just something to consider. Again, relates back to the claim that you're making in the marketplace, and does your practice for reconciliation really align with that claim? So with that, I will turn it over to Ali to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Mark. There was some great sort of pragmatic recommendations there. And now I would like to invite Saskia to wrap up with our last session.
Thanks, Ollie, and thanks, Mark and Christiaan. As Mark had mentioned, there are many considerations and practical implications that come with meeting your goals. And we are dealing with clients who've already made public commitments and working out how to meet those, and others who, before making any commitment, want to understand what's possible and what would it cost potentially before making any goals. And then we also have clients who are currently transitioning from their 2020 targets to future goals and looking for guidance on, you know, what could the pathway be, and how could they aggressively and pragmatically meet, you know, some targets. So one of the tools that we use to help clients is to build a roadmap. As you can see here, this is an example organization with multiple global locations, and a lot of the people we work with have locations that they own, or they have offices in leased buildings, so they have different possibilities for using renewable energy and energy attribute certificates to get to 100% coverage with renewable energy. So we ask these clients to start by giving us their consumption by location, ideally by country, and then any requirements that they might have. I think you might remember Chris presented a slide earlier with the different choices that you have when selecting renewable energy. If you have a technology preference, wind and solar over biomass or hydro, for example, or if you have an age of your source of renewable energy, if you would prefer to have renewable energy from projects in country, or grid connected is okay. And we use all of those criteria that you provide to then map out a roadmap of available solutions. If you could click. Here you see mapping out from 2017 out to 2020. Green area shows available EACs, available that meet all the criteria that you've provided. Often there's a budgetary requirement in there too. Orange-yellow is a possible solution. Maybe there's a little bit out of what you had specified, and red is no current solution. Doing this helps in many ways. It helps clients highlight geographies where they might need to invest in other solutions for renewable energy or prioritize working with local government and policymakers and the standards bodies to bring solutions forth. It also emphasizes markets where other approaches should be focused on. Again, this is really a very helpful tool to highlight options and to build a strategy. What we've seen in the markets is that they are moving fast and they are developing very quickly. So this needs to be regularly updated, but we provide consistent, continual communication about the evolutions in these markets, such as the webinar today. Taking this into the next slide, if I can. One of the things that comes out of mapping a roadmap like that is the identification of countries where there isn't a viable solution today. So if you looked at the previous slide, Israel was red in 2017. We, because we work with multiple companies, we see demands in different regions, and where a high quality EAC would be demanded and required, we can then work with project developers in the country and local experts in renewable energy to build and help deliver infrastructure for an EAC. And this is what happened in Israel. We worked, Ollie actually was instrumental, took the lead on this, working in Israel to map for IREC a country specification and what was the opportunity here, and then also to work with multiple project developers to tell them about the EAC market, the demand, the potential demand coming from voluntary buyers, and to help them register projects. This has led to, over time now, the first IRECs in Israel being issued and transacted in 2018. And Israel is just one example. We've worked, that's where we've helped actually set up a country, but we've also worked in, I think, 15 other countries with developers to register devices, so that there are accessible solutions for clients. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ollie to wrap up, and we can get to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saskia. That was a very clear explanation of how businesses can incorporate this into their strategies and their plans. So we've had our 3 presentations now, and it's almost time to transition to your questions, but I'm just going to rerun our audience poll. And I can actually give you the results of the first poll, which was that 2/3 of you were already considering yourself experts. So curious to know if we brought anyone up from the medium to expert level over the course of the past 30 minutes. I don't have the highest of expectations, but indeed it looks like 100% of you would now consider yourself experts. So perhaps those medium level folks have dropped off the call, who knows. But now we're going to turn to some questions. And so the first question here is, Christiaan, it's probably one for you. So someone's saying based on that timeline, there were lots of sort of rules and dates, but how strict are they? Who enforces them? And is there kind of flexibility?
A number of the dates will be fairly well set. A number of other dates, there will be flexibility. While of course much of this is a voluntary market, you will simply not be able to issue any more IRECs for 2017 as of today. That is part of the standard. Whether that date will shift in time as we go to next year, for example, that is possible, but I think in that case it's likely to be fixed. In the case of the guarantees of origin, again, there's lots of flexibility that does exist with regards to using 2017 goes or starting to use 2018 goes, but 2017 goes are expiring if you don't use them, and that again is a rule that is set, and there is nothing that is likely to change in that. I don't believe the sort of the auditing timelines in the US will necessarily change much. So again, by the end of Q2, the audit will have been completed if you do things according to Green E. The auditing, I believe, will become much quicker if everything is on a registry. and nothing anymore relies on paper attestations. But that buys us, say, 2 months, not an awful lot. So I think that the flexibility you need to look for is really in sort of the vintage matching that you are happy to do, as opposed to the ones that you can issue and buy at that precise moment in time.
Thank you, Christiaan. And then there's a sort of two questions here that, Mark, I'm going to probably send your way, so that as they're kind of related. So the first one is someone saying we tend to wait until our annual GHG reports are prepared before we transact. Are we paying too much? Is the question. And then someone else has a question kind of that was saying, if the recommendation is to buy early, then how, i.e. before you know those numbers, then how do you know how much to buy?
Yeah, you know, the answer to the first one, because this is a market, is a big maybe. But historically speaking, if you're waiting until you have your completed inventory after the first of the year, I would say that there's a higher risk to pay, that you'll be paying more. You know, at that time for the previous year's production. You know, there's, as I said, you know, it's a combination of availability, of demand, you know, the kind of the last minute push. So, you know, it's a market, so you can't say for sure, but historically speaking, I think it's more likely than not that you'll be paying more. And you know, to answer the second question, which is about, you know, well, how do I make an estimate if I'm covering, you know, we're sitting here in June of 2018, and I want to buy today for my 2018 consumption. How do I go about that? Most companies will look at their previous year consumption, actual consumption, and use that as an estimate, or some percentage of that, 95%, 90%, if they are going to do a reconciliation. If they are not going to do a reconciliation, you know, we see many companies just buying, basically they're using their actual previous year consumption as the estimate for the current year. So.
Thank you very much, Mark. And then this question for Saskia here that kind of relates to timing. So the question is, with the Israel example, you know, how long did that development activity take, and what did it take in terms of, you know, what kind of transaction size is needed to facilitate that kind of development activity?
Thanks, Ollie. So that took about 2 years, I'd say 18 months to 2 years, in order to get the country registered, and then to work with developers to get devices registered that we're able to issue. And then it was ongoing conversations about demand. So I can't say there's a specific size from one organization, because what we're able to do is we're able to aggregate market demand, because we work with so many companies globally, to identify countries where we can see multiple buyers. But I would say it's important, you know, we're not going to be doing this for 1,000 megawatt hours, but if you're up in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands megawatt hours annually, that can help move this forward.
Thank you for giving that kind of indication. And then we've got a question here about reconciliation. So someone's looking for kind of the specifics of how you might do a reconciliation. And so, Mark, I'll probably put that one to you. So is there an example, you know, from one of those EAC markets you could give of how a reconciliation would work?
Yeah, I mean, probably you know, we'll just take maybe the simplest and the most complex examples. You know, the simplest form of reconciliation is with IREC, because you know, there is basically IREC's, you know, if you're following, as most people do, the Scope 2 guidance, you know, you're basically, there is not prescriptive about matching production with consumption. So following the Scope 2 guidance, which basically, as Chris pointed out, says, you know, the EAC should be sourced as close as possible to the production, to the consumption period. You know, that gives you the flexibility. So if I overbought IRECs that were generated into 2017, there would be absolutely no problem applying those to the 2018 consumption. Now, you know, when it comes to, you know, to the more complex example, you know, guarantees of origin, where you've got this you know, more complex in a shorter window, and where there's, you know, specific rules about matching consumption with production. That's really, you know, a conversation. If you think that you're going to need to reconcile, that's really a conversation that you need to have at the time of transaction, and you know, we can schedule you know, the cancellation of those guarantees of origin in line with your consumption. So it's a bit more complicated and bespoke solution when it comes to guarantees of origin. And then, of course, in the middle, you have, you know, the U.S. Recs, where you do have this you know, 21-month window. So if you specify production, you know, from periods that overlap, you can, you know, you can roll forward quite easily. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yep, I think that probably did, Mark. And then I'm not too sure who's going to take this one. It's a bit of a crystal ball question around prices. So the question is, you reference sort of increasing prices in Europe and North America during the session. What's the outlook for pricing, you know, across the next year? And, you know, does that have an impact on, you know, the timing of purchases? I'm going to put that question to Saskia.
Well, it's a great question, and I did present the roadmap, which suggests that we might know future pricing. However, it is difficult to predict what's going to happen. What we're seeing is, you know, as more renewable energy comes onto the grid, the price ultimately is going to go down, but we're also seeing this balance between supply and demand and the market have impact on pricing, as was mentioned, the doubling in the US and in Europe since 2017. So one way that you can try and deal with that, I mean, it is hard to forecast. We do look at forwards, look into the future, and we do look for, you know, a few years. So we're working with a lot of clients at the moment with 2020 targets and are interested perhaps in committing to 2018, 19, 20 in a deal that will give them fixed pricing, so they can deal with, you know, changes in supply and demand that are coming down the line in the when they've also got a target that they've committed to meeting publicly.
Fantastic. Thank you, Saskia. That was a particularly tricky one. So we're running up against the time here, so I think I'm going to wrap things up. I'd like to thank you all once again for attending and for asking those questions, and a big thank you to the speakers for their presentations. If you've got any further questions on any of those presentations, then the email addresses are up on screen, as is the front cover of our optimization guide that we mentioned. You'll see in the handout section of this webinar that we've included our latest white paper, which gives an overview of everything that you've heard today. So this webinar is going to be available on our website. It's been recorded and will be sent out to everyone shortly. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues. And that's everything. Thank you and goodbye.